Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Pablo and Sara for inviting us to participate here, and also I want to thank the Education Department of the Museum of Modern Art for making all this possible. In my short presentation, I am going to talk about various uses and misuses of NSK passports and about various, well, functions and real and imaginary functions of that passport. Just on one little note, we didn't coordinate our presentation, four of us, the speakers, so there's going to be a little bit of overlap what Miran was saying just a few minutes ago with what I'm going to speak in my presentation too. So NSK Passport, just as the whole NSK State, should be understood sort of in the context of this Moscow Embassy event, which was happening in May and June of 1992 in Moscow, and was a one-month-long collaborative event between the group of Slovenian and ex-Yugoslav artists, critics, theoreticians, and Moscow artists and also critics as well. And what is important to understand about this, the significance of the Moscow Embassy, significance for the whole NSK enterprise and for the future NSK State and Time, was that it was the realization of certain community and commonality between these people that NSK wanted to conceptualize later on in that year. So NSK State and Time was established a few months later in autumn of 1992. And the passports, the NSK passports have to be understood as sort of, well, the testament of this commonality, the testament of this communication that happened in Moscow and something that they wanted to continue on. Of course, the whole NSK enterprise and the significance of these passports need to be understood also against the social political background of what was happening in Europe, specifically in Eastern Europe in the early 90s. As all of you know, many states disappeared, many states appeared in the early 90s, and so it was essentially this whole idea of the state was very much in flux. And Zizek actually at that time famously pronounced that, I'm going to quote about what art needs to do, that is to say, in the early 90s. Zizek said, "As far as art, according to definition, is subversive in relation to the existing establishment, any art which today wants to be up to the level of this assignment must be a state art in the service of still non-existent country." He said that in 1992, and actually NSK State and Time was also established in 1992. It is important to note that it is in the situations where citizenship and territorial integrity is in question that the NSK passports reverberate most strongly with people, with participants of these embassies, NSK events, collaborative events, and various other phenomena that NSK and IRWIN organize. So one of the earlier NSK passport offices was opened in Sarajevo in 1995, and at that time, as Miran mentioned, the Dayton negotiations were going on, and Dayton Accords were signed actually at the very time while NSK State was established temporarily in the National Theatre in Sarajevo. A number of passports were issued, several hundred of passports were issued, and many of them diplomatic passports, the NSK diplomatic passports were issued in Sarajevo. And Bosnian citizens use these passports in a variety of ways. One of the events, or one of the uses of the passports that I want to tell you about is by Edin Nomankadic. He's a Bosnian artist who was invited to participate in an art festival in South Korea. To get to South Korea was difficult by itself because all Bosnians had to get South Korean visa, and to get to South Korean visa, they first had to get actually to South Korean embassy, and the embassy that was issuing passports for Bosnians was only in Paris. So Edin Numankadic managed to get only the Schengen visa, the French visa, to get to Paris, and and he didn't have time to get the Korean visa. So he went on to Korea anyway, and upon trying to enter the country in the Seoul airport, he was sort of arrested on the spot because he didn't have the Korean visa. He felt that there was nothing much to lose, and so he produced his NSK diplomatic passports. NSK diplomatic passport. At that very moment, the police officers, the passport officers, actually organized an escort for him into hotel where he was staying in Seoul, and they provided a limo and so on, and so he managed to enter the country, participate in the art festival, and happily come back to Bosnia. Another use of passport which I want to recount over here was it's related to another Bosnian citizen, Ademir Kenovic. Shortly after the civil war in Yugoslavia, after 1995, after the Dayton Accords were signed, the travel between the former Yugoslav republics was still a little bit problematic because there was still psychological, social tension between these various nations, the Croats, the Bosnians, the Serbs, and so on. And so Ademir Kenovic actually used once a passport to cross the border from Slovenia into Croatia, and when he produced the NSK passport, he had no troubles, and the whole crossing of the border was well trouble-free and very easy. So NSK passports, in certain moments, they acquire actual, real, practical value, the use value, so to say, not only symbolic value. It comes as no surprise that the majority of passport offices in the early and mid-90s were established actually in Eastern Europe, because in Eastern Europe this sort of flux of the statehood and the whole idea of what a state means and what states will appear or disappear in the nearest future was very much at stake. And so here you see an image of NSK Passport Office in Warsaw. And in general, it is in the territories and the states where this sort of the idea of territorial integrity, or the idea of the statehood, is somewhat in question. That the passport, the idea of the passport, the idea of this sort of alternative citizenship in a conceptual entity reverberates and attracts many participants, and reverberates most strongly. So, for example, in Taiwan, well, the country that is claimed to be a part of another country, there was an NSK Passport Office opened in 2008, and a lot of testimonials were recorded on the video, and they're one of the most telling and most revealing about sort of the state of mind that the NSK passport induces upon its holders, its bearers. The artist that Miran mentioned, Charlie Kraft, he tried to use NSK passport actually within the United States. In the late 90s, he tried to board a plane within the United States, the domestic flight, by using NSK passport. So he was not arrested, but the passport was confiscated from him and the charge was that it is falsified document. Well, eventually he used his American passport to get back, I think, to Seattle. That's where he's from. And then a lot of sort of a long bureaucratic procedure ensued. And during that period, he was writing letters to various governmental agencies, federal agencies, because he wanted his passport back. And his argument was that he did not produce a falsified document because NSK passport is not a counterfeit. It is an original. And in the end, his passport was returned to him. So again, sort of this intertwining of the conceptual reality and actual practical everyday reality. And the passport is sort of a tool, actually, to knit together these two realities. As Miran has mentioned, one of the most memorable or most important events in the development of NSK State happened in the years 2005, 2007, because there was a massive influx of applications for NSK passports from Nigeria, and specifically from one region in Nigeria around the city of Ibadan. And obviously that puts quite a bit of strain on IRWIN and the whole NSK organization, because of course it was all happening against the background of the famous Nigerian scams where, you know, the princes and the businessmen promise you millions if only you pay a processing fee and so on. At the same time, IRWIN felt that it would be unfair and it would be strange and wrong, actually, not to issue those passports on a simple, for the simple reason because these applications coming from Nigeria. So, as Miran has mentioned, an interview office was established in London, and it ran for several days. And so members of Nigerian diaspora were interviewed, and the applicants themselves and their relatives were interviewed, and because IRWIN wanted to get sort of to the bottom of this massive popularity of NSK State in a certain region of Nigeria. Eventually, again, I'm repeating certain same facts as Miran has just did. There was a collaborative project with Center for Contemporary Art in Lagos in Nigeria in 2010. And one of the purposes of this project was, of course, to present the whole idea of NSK State and passport, but also to explain to people in the most plain terms that NSK State is not a state that you can actually physically visit. Maybe in your mind, maybe conceptually, but the passport is not good. It's not good for actual travel. And although, as I mentioned, there were several cases where the passport was used to cross borders and so on, it is advisable not to try that. So all ambiguity was abandoned, and up to that point, up to 2010 or 2009, the ambiguity was one of the key tactics how NSK passports and the NSK State were presented, talked about, and theorized. That is to say, NSK State, it is the state in time, not in territory, but is it a state? Is it just a conceptual art project, or is it some kind of political gesture that has certain reverberations in a political and social sphere? And for example, the passport, is it just a work of art, a printed matter? Or is it a tool actually to intertwine the political reality with a conceptual reality, with an artistic reality, and so on? So all that ambiguity was put aside for a simple practical reason as to prevent maybe a fraud, maybe a misunderstanding about the function of NSK passport. And the strangeness of the whole situation in Nigeria was that the passports themselves were beginning to take up a life of their own. In Lagos, in all this process of explaining that NSK State is not an actual country, a telling event happened. A young Nigerian man stood up in the audience and proclaimed the following: "Don't tell me that NSK State does not exist. I know a person who was there, and he said it was a beautiful country." It is hard to say what exactly that man heard and who told him that. But what is important to note is that in a moment like this, the aspirational imagination that NSK promoted grew faster than IRWIN or NSK could expect. All of a sudden, they found themselves on the receiving end of this aspirational and somewhat utopian verbal exchange. The aspirational vector came in a full circle back to NSK.